Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati Podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and tonight I am bringing you a rare solo episode. But my co-host Thomas and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. I just wrapped up a wonderful interview with an old friend of the show, David Jilk, who, if I recall correctly, was either the first or second guest we actually interviewed on this podcast. And this would have been back in 2019, 2020 when we started it. But he has published a new book called Epoch, E-P-O-C-H, a Poetic Psy-Phi Saga. And this is an epic poem, if you can believe this. It's an epic poem telling the story of the first artificial general intelligence and how it navigates the world, how it interacts with other people, how it thinks, what it values, and ultimately what its consequences are. Naturally enough, this led us into the rarefied terrain of philosophy of artificial intelligence. This is a favorite theme for us here at the Futurati Podcast. We've interviewed a lot of people, especially recently, about this, and really especially since the release of ChatGPT in November of 2022. So this has been on a lot of people's minds, and we cover artificial intelligence, we cover AGI, we cover the connections to neuroscience, we cover the scalability hypothesis and the extent to which we can assume that bigger networks will just continue becoming more capable until they get all the way up to AGI. We talk about the alignment problem. Dave is a fascinating guy, very successful entrepreneur and poet, and has been thinking about this stuff for just a really long time. He founded a company that was a solid 20 years ahead of the curve on the power of deep learning. So he's got very heterodox views, but they're grounded in a very solid understanding of the ideas, the literature, and the relevant scientific research. So I hope you get as much of this. I hope you get as much out of this as I did, because it's always a real pleasure to talk to Dave and to listen to him. So without further ado, this is our interview with David Jilk. Tonight, we're joined by David Jilk. After finishing MIT, David founded eCortex, a company that wound up being a solid 20 years ahead of the curve on deep learning, and he later worked on cognitive models for IARPA. He has founded or advised numerous other companies, including Harmonix Music Systems, creators of the wildly popular games Guitar Hero and Rock Band. He recently published Epoch, a Poetic Psy-Phi Saga, a science fiction epic poem that tells the story of the first fully human-level artificial intelligence. If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Thankfully. Okay, excellent. Okay. David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Trent.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the problems that you're working on today.
Well, so I've been working on AI-related things for almost a couple of decades, but not in the form you might normally think. I studied I took some graduate classes in neuroscience and what's called computational cognitive neuroscience at the University of Colorado, and worked with a professor, Randy O'Reilly, there, who has a kind of an integrated theory of the brain, and he loved building models of brain and cognitive functions. And I actually started a company with him as well, where we were doing kind of deep learning, deep networks before it was a thing. This was back in 2006. And for various reasons, among them that we were too early in terms of the technology. Another that the approach that he was using is very computationally intensive, and the successful direction in deep networks, of course, was Jeff Hinton's innovations with ReLU, where we're making it computationally less expensive and less accurate, right? And it turned out it didn't matter. So I was involved in that very early on, and of course I've continued to follow it, even as I started another company and left that company to someone else to run, and it became a research company. I stayed involved. Then I get involved in the kind of existential risk world, in terms of AI existential risk world, in terms of trying to think about how we can make AI safe, AGI in particular. We're not talking here about merely visual object recognition technologies or merely chatbots. We're talking about kind of the whole ball of wax, right? AGI. So I wrote a few papers on that. I have something of a iconoclastic and contrarian view on these things, which won't surprise you at all, as we've talked about these things in the past. And so that's what drove me toward this subject matter. As I've been telling people, the book started out as a poetry project, not an AI project. But as soon as I started, it became obvious what I had to write about. So.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah. So the book you're referencing, and we'll talk about this in the introduction, but it's Epic, a Poetic Psy-Phi Saga. So this is, Epic Poetic Psy-Phi Saga. And it is it's a fiction book and a long poem as well. It's like an epic poem, and there's fiction sort of, or just standard prose kind of interspersed throughout. It's really fascinating stuff. So let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, we were talking before we recorded, you said the genesis of the book was shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020, and you got to spend most of the pandemic working on it. So that's great. Great use of the pandemic. Tell us a little bit about its genesis. I mean, what was you said it started as a poetry project, then became an AGI project. So I imagine that's the first time that sentence has ever been spoken in any natural language. So that's probably a fascinating story. Probably a fascinating story. Why don't you tell us how it all began?
Yeah, I mean, I had been writing poetry for a few years. I have 2 little poetry collections available on Amazon. And most of my friends read them, and I was enjoying it. And at some point, I said, I want to try writing a narrative poem, and maybe an epic poem. And so I started thinking about that, and in December 2019, I started writing, I knew pretty quickly that this was the topic, as I said, that this was the topic that I needed to write about. And I've looked at my old notes, and I think I said I was aiming for 80 pages.
There's quite a bit more substantial than that.
It's about 310 pages of text and then 80 pages of endnotes. I wasn't necessarily committed to it yet at that point. I think as the pandemic began, I had written enough that I was sort of excited about it. I had a lot of things I wanted to say about AI, about what our future with AI is going to be like, or could be like. I had a lot of things I wanted to say about the way that people were thinking about these issues. I had some real concerns, in particular about the kind of, there's a kind of sense of certainty around some of this stuff, or desire for certainty in an area where it's sort of obvious to me that we can't have certainty. The issue was, if you take a kind of a Yudkowsky sort of view, it's like, well, if it's possible that, we're going to destroy all humans, that's going to destroy all humanity, then we shouldn't do it at all. And I don't know how you stop it. And that was another thing that I wanted to say, right, is that I don't quite understand what this means by we shouldn't do it. I don't know who we is, or what sort of fiat power we have over we. And so I wanted to say all these things, and I wanted to say it in a way that wasn't just another paper on archive that, nobody would read. And so I said it this way. I do think, I'm a big believer in form and content. As a poet, I'm a big believer in form and content, supporting each other. And one of the ways in which poetry supports this idea is that difficulty with notions of certainty around something, first of all, futuristic, and that doesn't exist yet, and also about kind of some of the more complicated societal and human aspects of it.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, let's stick with that form content distinction and the ways in which those two things interact. So I can't recall offhand, I believe I asked Frederick Turner, our mutual friend, the same question, but what is it that the poem allows you to say that maybe would not be as easy to say, or would not be as compelling in prose or in an archive paper or in a proof?
Well, to explain that, I think I have to go back to why I chose some other elements of the book. So the story is told. It's narrated by the main character. It's kind of almost like a memoir, a coming of age story about the individual who's speaking. But the individual who's speaking is the AI.
Mm-hmm.
And so it takes the first person point of view for the AI, and that serves a number of purposes. The immediate reaction that some people in this field will have to that is, oh, well, you're just anthropomorphizing AI.
That's my father.
And that's correct. I am doing it intentionally. It's not an accident or not just a sort of a subtle sort of thing. Because it's my strong suspicion that is the way that AGI will first actually occur. In other words, all of the other kinds of constructs that have been invented since the beginning of AI in the 50s, they're all constructs of human minds looking from within as to what intelligence is and what general intelligence is, and theorizing about that. And I take the view that we have exactly one category of example of what we think of as general intelligence, and it's us. And so I continue to believe that will be the first thing that's successful. And so it's not just a poetic device or a rhetorical device to take the AI's point of view. I actually think that that will be and have it be anthropomorphic in nature. I think that's what will work. And if you look at the last 10 years and all the huge progress that has been made, so for example, with AlphaGo beating humans at Go, all the other things that have happened with simple deep networks, and then of course more recently with LLMs, all of these things have very strong kind of homomorphic maps to human brains. And I should say from them, and they're modeled after the kinds of computations that brains are thought to do, and which computational models of brains actually do, and end up looking like the fMRIs or the single cell recordings that we do in neuroscience. And so all of this kind of leads me to this idea of speaking from the AI's point of view, which also allowed me to, people have asked me about, well, was it hard to imagine what it's like to think like this alien intelligence? And I said, not so much, because I don't think it's going to be as alien as a lot of people would like to think it is. And furthermore, and you see this in LLMs, any intelligence, any general intelligence that has all of our capabilities will also have our culture. They'll have our language. It will have our language, right? An LLM knows a lot of books, lots of books that you and I don't even know, right? It's read so many books. And that means that it has access to our culture, our values, all those sorts of things. So alignment starts to look very different than the kinds of projects that people have done where they try to invent what they call a seed AI that tries to make itself more intelligent constantly, and at every step, right? It's just kind of a completely different way of thinking about alignment.
Well, it's fascinating. Yeah, so you actually preempted several additional follow-up questions. So I was going to ask you about projecting yourself. And I was going to drop that Wittgenstein quote about if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand what it was saying. You have this heterodox view that the first AIs, the first real AIs, will be fairly anthropomorphized, just sort of out of the box, and that many, many human traits will kind of come along with intelligence in the first place, which I think a lot of the preeminent researchers in the field would disagree with you on. So what's the basis for thinking that?
Well, they had 70 years to try to build it their way, and they utterly failed. And now they're building it like brains, and it's working. And all of the progress in the last 10 years is completely antithetical. And you see this when they write about it. They try to be dismissive about it. And I shouldn't be too aggressive here, but I really think that they're wrong-headed about it. They're thinking about it as a serial computation model and level of description of what's going on in cognition, and that just doesn't work. And they kind of the field kind of worked very hard for 70 years to prove that it didn't work. And so it's an interesting thing why that's the case. And there are lots of stories even from the 60s and even from the 80s where the good old-fashioned AI world wanted to try to stamp down neural network approaches to it. They just didn't like that. That's a way to do it. I've never understood really exactly why. I have my theories, but I don't want to get into those here. In any case, there's actually a divide, just to be clear, in the field in terms of who would sort of vaguely agree with me and who would probably strongly disagree with me. And all of the progress is coming from the people who, the Google DeepMind invented the transformer architecture that is the basis foundation for LLMs. So if you're thinking that large language models are a signal that we're making progress against this problem, you're talking about Google DeepMind. And if you read Google DeepMind's papers and about their approach, they very much think about brains and they think about anthropomorphization. And they, of course, as is necessary, they take shortcuts, they abstract, they do, they're trying to find that right level of description. And the right level of description doesn't look like a C program, in my view. It looks like a parallel distributed network, kind of along the lines of what Jay McClellan might have said, of small computational systems that are arranged, by the way, very importantly, they are arranged in an architecture that supports the various kind of functional attributes of the brain. So this is kind of my view of AI, and I freely admit that I could be completely wrong, and someone could come up with it. And in fact, at the very end of the book, I'll provide a teaser here. There is discussion about going on to those other approaches and seeing if maybe now that we've got something that works, maybe we can make those other approaches work now that we understand more about intelligence. So.
That's fascinating. So I want to push on this idea that the current approaches are analogous or isomorphic in any important way to the brain. I understand that neural networks came out of Hubel and Wiesel's work on the cat visual processing system. Obviously, they're called neural networks, so there's a clear inspiration there from the brain. But it's not clear to me that a deep neural network really processes information or functions in the same way my brain does. There's certain high-level analogs, but it's not doing the same thing. It's not perceiving the way I do. It's not embedded in an agent, importantly, and I do think that has important ramifications. So what...
That's right. So those are some of the things you described just now are the things that are missing, right? So the agency, the embodiment, for humans, you need executive control. These things don't typically have episodic memories. But if you look at maps of neurons in animals when they are looking at stuff, and if you look at the maps of a deep network that is a vision network, it looks pretty much the same. They're really, it's very much like that. And architecturally, one of the interesting differences, by the way, between typical deep networks and brains, and let's call it mammal brains for now, if we're just talking about perception. One of the differences is that in the mammal brains, there are a large number of top-down connections in addition to the feed-forward connections, or feedback connections, we might call them. They're only a fraction. I don't know what they are, 10, 20, 30%, something like that. But that's where some of the really interesting stuff comes from, because that's how executive attention is imposed on the perceptual system. And so these are all things that people are sort of working on at various stages in various ways. So I don't make a claim that LLMs are like human brains. Transformers are really not neural networks. They're trying to emulate things at a slightly different level of description. And I've had arguments with Seth Hurd, who you know well, about, he thinks that it's still sufficient. I'd argue that transformer architectures are not going to cut it But who knows, right? I mean, we don't know the right level of description. I think, and the right level of model to model in software. And this is maybe a novel notion that you and I haven't talked about before. All of this relies on the idea that the brain is computational in some form or another. And so the idea is that the brain is also simulating some kind of computation. It's not that we're trying to simulate the brain. It's that the brain is trying to perform some computation in a very complex biological way. And that's what cognition is. And we are just trying to find that computation that is performed, but it doesn't look like a series of statements. It looks like an emergent process that happens in the interaction of a whole lot of, or dynamic interaction of a whole lot of smaller units. And so I may have gotten off track with your question, but that was the
that's how it goes. That's how it goes around here. We should call it an off track podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the simple answer is no. Of course, these things aren't whole brains. Otherwise, they'd be walking around and doing things in the world, right? Potentially, if they had bodies as well. I tend to be partial certainly to embodiment, and I've been learning a little bit about the ecological brain theories, where where actually the mind is really, or the ecological mind, where it's part of the environment is part of it, and I think that can go too far pretty easily, but there's definitely something to it, right? We exist in a world, and the mind interacts with that world, and it's not really much of a mind if it's just in a vat and not attached to anything.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
Yeah, for my part, I have also been going down some of those rabbit holes when I have the time. So we've done a couple of recent episodes that you might find interesting. One was with Dr. Gregory Salmieri. So he's actually an epistemologist. But we were talking about agency, aliveness, volition, consciousness, and sort of related topics, specifically how you validate a concept like that, how you correctly form a concept like that. He's an objectivist, so he's very opinionated on how concepts work. And then we tried to parlay all that over into a discussion of AI risk and AI safety and Bayesian epistemology as well. So that's one that's definitely interesting. But there was also, I'm blanking on his name. I'm looking at my list here.
Yeah, I've been listening to the recent ones on AI, or some of them at least.
Okay, so you probably
always fascinating, and I will say that your questions are very probing and very well informed. So it's one of the reasons I was psyched to do this interview.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you. That's very flattering. It was Johannes Jaeger was the one I was thinking of. So he does philosophy of biology, and I've long kind of suspected that a deep study of that field would be very fruitful and would bring a lot over with you, because I worry that we often kind of hand wave when we're talking about agency or action or aliveness. Like we kind of port a lot of these concepts over in a way that's very flimsy. And I think that in order to fully validate the case or to refute it, then I'm talking about the AI safety case, you've really got to understand what you mean by these terms, right? Because we're agents. That's important. It matters that we're agents, and it matters how that process evolved the first time it evolved, right? So natural selection, when it was operating on humans, we were hominids. We were already agents. We were already trying to stay alive. That obviously matters for the story that we tell. And then general intelligence emerged in that situation. And it's not obvious to me that you can just take that over by analogy and say, well, we've got gradient descent. If we just press on this hard enough, minds fall out of it. It's like, well, do they? Are you sure? Like, do we really know all the facts we need in order to make that case? And actually,
I don't really think that's even a question. We obviously don't.
Yeah, I think we obviously don't. Well, there's other things too. They say like, you don't have to be conscious in order to be intelligent. This is one of the big things I took out of the intelligence explosion hypothesis, evidence, and import. That was Anna Salomon's and Luke Melhauser's paper. I read this, I don't know, 2011 or 2010, something like that. It's like, no, you don't need that. You don't need consciousness for it. But we I've not even begun to map the connections between consciousness and action and volition and agency and all these things. We've hardly even begun that conversation. I really don't know that you can say that for sure. I mean, maybe they're right, but I suppose I'm less convinced as a result of having interacted with some of these other people. But I was going to ask, do you buy this case that if you just build a big enough deep learning network, if you just feed it enough multimodal data, even though it's not embodied, it's not an agent in any meaningful sense, those things kind of fall?
Yeah. So I think this idea of just training a big neural network on a bunch of data, and it's just all about the data and how much training we do, that's a misunderstanding, not only of what needs to happen, but what people are really trying to do. I mean, there's a relatively strong understanding that we need architectural heterogeneity in the overall model. Even if it's just to do certain kinds of cognition, let alone agency. And agency, of course, is going to need to have, somehow it's going to need to look like the lizard brain and some things like that. So, that's what reinforcement learning is thought to maybe model some of that, but I don't think we really understand where that comes from or how much is needed. I do suspect, but I don't think this is important. I do suspect that things like, the experience of free will, consciousness, all that stuff, I think that sort of stuff probably just falls out, but I don't know that we ever can know, right? I mean, just as I don't really know that you're conscious, other than the fact that, you have an architecture that's very similar to mine, and you existed in the same, basic conditions that I did, and you seem to act that way. I infer that you're conscious. I can't experience it, and so we may never know whether AIs are conscious or not, just as we don't know that other people are directly. And so, and because they look different and are built somewhat differently, but I can guarantee you that they're going to say that they are.
Yeah, well, they already have. That's called already problems.
That's all. That's a lot of that is kind of clearly not faked, but it's clearly a consequence of the data. And well, of course, maybe ours is a consequence of the data. So, and if you follow Dennett, we're not even conscious, and we just think we are. So, so I suspect that those sorts of things fall out, but I don't think in the book, the main character speaks, and it seems like the main character is conscious, but it could also be just taken as thinking and experiencing. And whether it's conscious or not, I don't know whether we need to know about that, even though it is.
Well, if it's experiencing, I'm prepared to bite that bullet and say it's conscious. I mean, to a first approximation, that's what consciousness is. It's at the most basic level, it just is that fact of experience. If you have it, you're conscious. If you don't, you're not. Even if it's a glimmer, you've got a glimmer of consciousness. So if it's experiencing, it's definitely conscious. Whether it's anything like ours is a separate question. But
that's one theory of experience and consciousness. I mean, this is part of the problem, right? There. I mean, everybody has their theory, everybody has their approach, and they've all got arguments for it, and we can all disagree and such. But I'm not sure. I'm confident that we don't really know right now, and that we might find some arguments more plausible than others, and so. What does it even mean to experience? I'm not sure we've delved into that concept enough. It may be a synonym for consciousness, the way you're describing it. And so then now we're circular. And so, so this is, I try to stay away from philosophy of mind, both in my interpersonal interactions, as well as in the story, because I don't think it adds that much. That's what everybody wants to know about and think about. And yet, in terms of the actual outcomes, in terms of the, is AI going to kill us all? Is it going to make us into their pets? Is it going to just leave and ignore us? What is it going to do? Those sorts of questions, it doesn't really matter whether it's conscious in the way that we think about it. It doesn't matter whether it has, quote, free will in the way that we think about it. It's going to do what it does. And so I pursue the story.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
I think pretty much entirely ignoring philosophy of mind questions.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's a much more difficult story to write around philosophy of mind questions. I wanted to circle back on something you said earlier about how perhaps consciousness just falls out of this process of lots and lots of, like, billions of little...
You didn't hear me say that I try to stay away from philosophy.
Well, no.
Interactions.
I'm going to ask it. It's actually not about, it's not about philosophy of mind. But you said it sort of falls out of a process, let me just say. So are you skeptical of the idea, which I take to be the standard, like Yudkowskian writ these days, the gospel, that these networks, if you run them long enough and you have enough data, eventually a mind falls out, an agent falls out, a general intelligence falls out. I think I could interpret some of your comments as being you being skeptical of that claim, and others as you being maybe endorsing that claim a little bit. So just for the record, do you think that's wrong? Do you have a way of thinking about that?
Yes, I think it's wrong. I think one of the things that Yudkowsky does, and by the way, I'm a fan of some of his other work. Adequate Equilibria is not the best written book because he grabbed posts from less wrong, but it's an amazing way of looking at society. But on this topic, I think that he's kind of missing the boat on a lot of things, and we could dig into some of those. But the main thing is he talks a lot about how hard it's going to be to align AI. But he seems to think that it's going to be easy to build it. In other words, he doesn't really, he thinks that we just need to get, he seems to think that we just need to get the right seed AI or as you say, right, just feed enough data to these big things. There's no talk of architecture. There's no talk of how does this actually need to work? And one of the things that is fascinating about the field of neural networks since their very beginning, all the way up to today, when they're extremely sophisticated, is the math that follows these techniques, right? So ways of characterizing what's happening mathematically, not just at the kind of computational level of the individual neuron, but kind of at the larger scales, the mesoscales and the macro scales within the network. And I think the kind of, we're going to build it and we're not going to understand anything about how it works and it's going to kill us all is really glossing over all of the meat. And when you start to get into, well, how does it work and how are we going to make it work? It's going to become, it's going to be much more feasible to work on alignment questions when we do that. That does not mean I think they're going to be easy. But my point is, I think that the concern that it's going to be hard to align alongside the kind of assumption that it's not going to be all that hard to build, I think that's very misguided.
Interesting. So I think what he would say at this point in the conversation is, well, it's obviously easier to build a thing that explodes than to build a thing that explodes exactly when you want it to and exactly where you want it to and does not misfire and has no realistic probability of misfiring. I think he would say, obviously, it's not that it's going to necessarily be easy to build, so
the effort in the Manhattan Project was primarily in making sure that it didn't explode when you didn't want it to?
Well, no, in that case, what you're trying to do is, there was a concern that the neutron chain reaction would ignite the atmosphere. So yeah, but part of it was trying to.
That was a joke that somebody made that was very overstated. If you've just watched the Oppenheimer movie about the Manhattan Project, that they way overdid that. That was not the factual basis of what happened there. The scientists were never genuinely concerned about that. It was something that somebody brought up, but kind of as an aside. The real issue is whether the thing would fizzle and throw nuclear material all over the place in the vicinity, right? And those are big problems. And of course, the whole problem with a nuclear weapon. And by the way, my book, I don't know how much of it you read, but the book is a lot about nuclear war and nuclear weapons.
Interesting.
And one of the other challenges with the alignment problem of AI is, well, we have other existential threats. And here at this point, they would say, well, nuclear war isn't going to kill us all. And by the way, they don't know that either.
Well, he always says, like, I'm less concerned about existential risks that could plausibly have survivors. Like the ones I'm worried about, the one I'm worried about is the one that doesn't have survivors, because you're up against something much smarter. I've read way too much Yudkowsky Twitter. I've got like this.
Yeah, I try not to read him because I think it's sort of funny. So, and I'm probably going to piss off a few people here, but the less wrong community, and that community uses a term, and they call themselves rationalists. And
problematic.
There's an older, and that's fine. And I'm a fan of rationality, obviously, and I think a lot of the stuff they do is good stuff. And a lot of the discussions are interesting, but there's an older definition of rationalist, which is the kind of the Leibniz, Descartes sort of model of rationalism, which is or even the Catholic churches, which is you start from the true premises and you just deduce your way down. And there are some things that have been kind of analyzed in that community, concluded, and turned into dogmatic premises. And kind of this idea that if AI exists, it has no interesting options other than to use our atoms to build more computation. That we could get into that, but that goes well beyond the scope of the book. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, are there any it sounds like you don't think alignment will be easy, but you're estimating that it will be quite a bit more straightforward than Yudkowsky would claim. I mean, he seems to think it's almost impossible. I mean, we just don't even have, we're not on step one yet. We haven't even started writing the introduction of the book that would solve alignment.
I don't think that's true at all. Look at what LLMs do. They're extraordinarily well aligned with what we want. They do a lot of what we want. When we talk to them, they talk like other people. They understand our culture. You ask them a question about what it's like to be human, they can answer it probably better than a lot of people can. And they with just a sort of relatively small amount of reinforcement learning. And in fact, they've been working on ways to leverage this because you need humans to do the reinforcement learning, right? They got these systems to kind of give the kinds of and in fact, that's actually what makes it frustrating for me, is that they give the kind of answers these feedback people wanted them to get. And so with just a relatively small amount of feedback, they did pretty much exactly what people wanted. They give the kinds of answers you want. They're polite. They're kind of encouraging. They're always asking you if you want more help. They do all these things, and that's not like programmed in lines of text. That's, they've learned that that's the kind of thing that they want. It's not the developers that learned that and then programmed it in. It learned it from experience. And so I think to say that we're nowhere with alignment is sort of obviously wrong. I mean, these systems, because they know our language, they know a lot about us and our culture. And if we tune it so that it tries to, so that its quote motivations, and I'm using that metaphorically, are oriented toward what we want through reinforcement, then it kind of does that. And so that doesn't mean we've answered the problem, but I think that the idea that we've only scratched the surface, I think where that comes from is this desire for certainty, this idea that, well, if we don't get it right the very first time, then it might kill us all, and we can't tolerate that probability. And it's like, at some point you got to realize that there is no certainty in the world. The world is not a Turing machine. It's not fully predictable. And what happens there, it's going to be possible that it goes wrong. And furthermore, there's no way you can stop it from progressing at some level. I mean, you can stop funding it, you can regulate, etc. But there will always be other players. It's not like nuclear weapons in that respect, where it takes a lot of investment and is very dangerous to do the work on a daily basis. Instead, small groups can conceivably do this stuff. So,
Well, that's fascinating. How much of that plays into the book? Do you discuss alignment at all in Epoch?
That's what it's all about. I mean, what the book, I mean, there are many, many different themes and topics in the book. AI is really, it's in some ways, it's a cover story for some other questions like how does technology play into society? What's its role? It makes predictions about what will happen 200 years in the future. Not really. It's not really a prediction. It's a fictional characterization, but it attempts to show how the AI thinks about this and what it wants and how it came to decide what its own purpose would be. And I refer to something I call in proper case, the human question. So these are all things in the book, and it deals with that. What is it going to be like for the AIs? What do they do? What do they want? And you can turn that all back and ask the question, what do we want? And this is a big part of the problem with alignment. There's this sense, I think among some alignment folks anyway, that we know what humans want. We know what the human, we know what it is we're trying to align it to. And I find that just so incredibly funny in this election year that we think humans want the same things. Now, of course, there are some overlaps in what humans want, and those are really important. And in fact, a successful situation might be one where we just find that overlap. But that's not, that's the difficulty that we find in society too, is that people are not interested in just the overlap. They want to impose their approach on everybody else. And so, I'm preaching to the choir here, the objectivist Trent, but right.
Yeah.
But, so this idea that we even know what we want to align it with is also challenging. So I dig into that too, right? What do humans want?
Well, I know what you want, and that is for people to buy this book. So why don't you tell us where we can do that?
Oh, so, well, it's on Amazon. If you actually want the hardcover, you can order that through Ingram Spark. And the best way to do that is to go to the website for the book. And the website is epoch.fyi, so epoch.fyi. And that will, there's lots of materials there. There's playlists, which, musical playlists, which are songs that are, and pieces that are referenced in the book. There are, there's a PDF of all the notes, so you can put that on your phone. It's scaled to be readable on a phone, and you can read along the notes while you're reading the story in the book. I should mention also, by the way, that now that the book is out, I've gotten a little bit of input from some readers that I'm sort of surprised. I thought it was going to be harder for people to read than it is. It's a lot of it's poetry. It's designed to be readable poetry. It's not, really kind of airy sort of, what does this even mean kind of poetry. It's not like that. But still, it could conceivably be challenging. But people have been reading it in a couple days and being very pleased. So I should mention that also. If you've been if people are concerned about that they're interested in the science fiction, but they're not so sure about the poetry, it's probably tractable. Maybe a little harder than usual, but.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuraudiopodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
A lot of the science fiction is hard to read anyway.
I haven't found it difficult at all, and I'm not done with it. But no, it's very readable. It is challenging conceptually, but not in terms of the words on the page, which I think is the best way to do it, right? So it's not like Faulkner, where he could describe a woman sitting in a chair, and 10 pages later, I've just lost the plot. I don't know what's going on. No, it's very lucid, very well put together, and I intend on reading it in the next week, probably, or finishing it rather. I've started on it now.
Great. Well, I'll be interested to hear your comments after you're done.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it, Dave. It's a pleasure as always. You're always welcome back on, and we look forward to interviewing you for your next book.
Thanks a lot, Trent.